All right.
I thought this was America.
All right. I think we're live with all of our 0 people for now. So if someone joins in,
Cool.
hope you guys enjoy. You ready to go, man?
Let's rock it.
All right, guys. Oh, man, I look like I'm gigantic compared to you. Let me back up a little bit. Phil's 4'3".
There you go.
Yeah, that'd be
I'm a sloucher, too.
Yeah,
That doesn't
yeah,
help.
that's okay.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, I am bigger than you.
That's true.
All right, guys. You're going to see me adjust the camera. This is my super professional way of doing things. We're in the office of my Jiu-Jitsu Academy. My name is Bill Jones, head instructor of top-level martial arts in beautiful downtown Cuyahoga Falls. You're watching Professor's Corner. Today we have a very special guest. His name is Dr. Phil Hamrick. I rarely ever call you Dr. Phil, but that is your title.
It is.
It turns out you've done some work to get that.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. A year or two.
I had the illusion of doing work during that whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Phil, first of all, thank you for being here.
Happy to do it. Yeah.
And I tell you what, I normally give like my view of what you do and what you know.
Yeah.
I'm going to say my goal in this whole conversation is
Yeah.
really just to act as kind of like the layperson. And,
Sure.
And I mean, that's not hard for me to do because, for anybody who doesn't know my background, I have a couple bachelor's degrees, which means that I have I can read the books, but that doesn't really mean I know a whole lot, right? Like that's what I've learned those mean over time.
That's fair.
Which is sad because when you first graduate, you think you're really smart.
Yeah.
But anyway, Phil has a PhD, and I'll let him explain exactly what it's in. But in general, you're an expert in learning. Right?
Yeah. So I have a PhD from Georgetown University, 2013. Several master's degrees before that. And my focus during my all of my graduate school and for the 15 or so years since graduating has been the roles of learning and memory, general learning and memory systems that work for lots of things. But I focus primarily on language because language is very interesting to me. But the general learning and memory systems stuff applies in lots of domains, and they end up applying in Jiu-Jitsu as well. So starting Jiu-Jitsu here actually has been a cool way for me to sort of reapply or relearn a lot of the stuff that I've been thinking about in other domains for a long time.
That's really cool. You should do a study in Jiu-Jitsu sometime.
I need to. Once I get that last promotion, I don't have to worry about anything else. I can just do the fun things.
Maybe this will.
Yeah.
This conversation will start something for you.
This has definitely made me want to go into this more. It's also made me wow, people get really upset about this stuff.
Guys, so we're going to talk a little bit today. We're going to talk about a lot of things, I think, but we're going to discuss a little bit of ecological dynamics, which is kind of an entire approach. I think it gets used improperly and in its context to how Jiu-Jitsu is taught. Specifically, I think what is used in Jiu-Jitsu is the constraint-led approach to learning, which Robert Gray talks about in his book, How We Learn to Move. And that's based on works of other experts in the field and stuff. So, but that's probably the book where a lot of this started, and then led some people down some rabbit holes to say, hey, how can we learn to move better?
Sure.
But I guess I'm going to start with what I think is, I don't know, the more I feel like I learn, the less I feel like I know.
Yep.
And so I'm just going to ask you a really dumb question.
Great.
What does it mean to learn?
It's the $1 million question. I've always answered that question as learning is adaptation on the timescale of a single human lifespan. So we think about adaptation and evolution, all these kinds of things, is these incremental changes that happen across species over, eons, basically. Learning is essentially your brain and your body's way of scaling that down into a quicker process so that you can adapt to your environment. So you can kind of reduce any learning, I think, to essentially just calling it adaptation. You can get technical and say, for me, in my work, it means to take some sort of external information and encode it into my brain somehow and to store it there with some permanence, because we can, of course, maybe store it and then forget it and things like that. So we can get into the minutiae of what learning is mechanically, so to speak, or cellularly or things like that. But just plain and simple, it's adaptation to your environment. It might be optimal adaptation. That's what we usually want. I want optimal adaptation for jiu-jitsu so I can compete or whatever. But it could be less than optimal, or in some cases like detrimental, where the adaptation actually makes things harder for you. Again, just like evolution, but it's just shortened to like
Okay.
2 minutes or a whole, couple of years of graduate school or things like that.
All right. So I think we've all been in that position. Yeah, I'm just kind of going off what you just said. That
Yeah.
position where like you learn whatever move and you're
Mhm.
trying to hit it
Yeah.
and it's close, but someone says, "Hey man, try taking this grip," and you're like, "Oh, that's it. That's what
Sure.
I'm missing."
Yeah.
And then like a week later, you completely forget what they told you, or your body's just not doing it.
Sure,
So
sure.
I think what most people really want out of it is that permanence,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Like cool if I learn how to do math.
Right.
It would be really cool if I could still do it in 20 years.
Yes, absolutely.
So I guess the question becomes, what different models are there
Sure.
for that you've seen?
Yeah.
And that's probably a giant question, but
It is, but we could distill it down pretty
yeah.
easily.
And
yeah.
I guess a secondary question to follow up, if you want to kind of wrap them
Yeah.
into one or
Yeah.
however you want to do it, is how does that apply? Because I think some people might watch this and say, "Oh, this guy's an expert in learning languages. That has nothing to do with
Sure.
jiu-jitsu."
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Like, just kind of playing,
Yeah.
straw manning you, if you will.
Sure. Yeah.
So how does that all play into physical movement? Is
Mhm.
there any difference at all?
Yeah.
So
No, that's a great
take
question.
it.
So I'll take the second one first, just to sort of be clear on the point where the learning similarities between something like language and jiu-jitsu, that they are in fact there, and that in some cases there are differences. Where they are similar is in the contributions of different brain systems to the learning process. And we could go on a deep dive because there's tons of little sort of subsystems that do different things for the learning process. For our purposes, I think we can reduce it to two simple ones, but both are very well understood, very well characterized. One is the declarative memory system. I say memory, but memory is just the other side of the learning coin.
Okay.
So it's there for learning and for storage of what's been learned. That's what most people think of when they think of memory. I remember my 5th birthday and like blowing out the candles. That's my memory. It's a video playing back in my head, that kind of thing, right?
Okay.
That's also the memory system we use to remember facts and just general stuff. Columbus is the capital of Ohio. Don't put your hand there during the armbar, put it over here instead, that kind of thing. This contrasts with procedural memory, which is what most people think of when they think of motor memory or muscle memory. When people say muscle memory, they're talking about procedural memory.
Okay.
And this is what we do where we have to, repetition is going to be important for our conversation, where people have to repeat some sort of action over and over and over again in order for it to become essentially an automatic behavior. Riding a bike.
You're already getting hate. Our one viewer, hi,
Hey!
welcome by the way, is already hating you. I'm
That's
telling
okay.
you you're wrong. That
Yeah,
repetition is useless.
Yeah,
So
no. Well, we can talk about kind of repetition.
we can talk about that later.
And that's important. But yeah, so that procedural system is what we do for a lot of jiu-jitsu. It's also what we do for a lot of language. It's how we become sort of fluent in a foreign language. We have to build up this habit of assembling pieces together into these larger ideas, these larger sentences and things like that. Jiu-jitsu is in many ways the same way. We start having these little atomic pieces. Maybe a technique is more akin to a word or a phrase. And what you start to do is try to build them up and chain them together. You're always talking about chaining moves together in your jiu-jitsu training. And it's the same basic underlying principles between the two. Declarative memory is good for learning sort of consciously, often verbally. Here's what you should do. Here's how it is done. You can kind of learn quickly, but it's easily forgotten, to your point about where to put your hand during a technique and then forgetting it a week later. Language is the same way. That sort of explicit instruction where you're deliberately telling someone here's what to do is good for quick learning, but it's also good for quick forgetting. And so what it kind of does is act as a crutch for you to build up a larger repertoire of chained together events. But you need that sort of crutch to help facilitate building those longer chains of procedures or of motor movements. And that's where all the practice and the repetition and drilling and all those kinds of things come in. So broadly speaking, language and jiu-jitsu, yeah, they're different. They anatomically require different things and stuff like that. But at the level of how they are learned, there are a heck of a lot of similarities. So that's the sort of that part. As far as the models go, we have in cognitive science, neuroscience, things like that, we have some different models about how we think those different memory systems do their job or how they cooperate or interact. But the fact that they're there and they sort of have certain kinds of jobs is pretty well established. No one really debates that too much at this point. There are sort of arguments over how cooperative are they, or do they sort of compete with one another? And there's conflicting evidence there. So there are rabbit holes we could go down where we're sort of not sure how those memory systems play together. But their broad functions and what roles they would have in things like jiu-jitsu, skill learning, and learning to move, pretty well understood, I think. There's always deeper that we can dig and ask questions that we don't have answers to, but we understand those pretty well, I think, at this point. So as far as models go, this is sort of a classic from the 1970s, really, model that's just been sort of refined and honed since then. The original ideas are like, they go back to Aristotle. I'm pretty sure that guy thought of everything.
Yeah, he's pretty smart.
And he's just like hanging around Greece thinking about shit.
Yeah, that's pretty smart.
Yeah, he seems to do okay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the philosophy. What didn't he do?
Yeah, I mean, he was on top of things well before a lot of other people were. Maybe not at the level of scientific evidence, but the ideas were there, yeah.
Okay. So I think that kind of gives us at least a diving board
Sure.
into this conversation about ecological dynamics, and potentially how it relates. And I guess this is a good spot for me to also say my goal here isn't to discredit anything. I actually really like ecological dynamics. I find it very, very, very interesting. And especially constraint-led drills that I've been doing in classes, I think people really enjoy them, and I think people get a lot out of them.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of people come to me and say, "Hey, man, those are really fun," and
Sure.
I feel like I'm getting a lot out of it.
Sure.
So I think there's a lot to be had there. I guess let's back up before I get into any questions I have
Sure.
about that.
Yeah.
But how well do you feel you understand ecological dynamics? Is it something you run into before, say, this book?
That's a really good and tricky question to answer. All of the references, the citations, the studies he's talking about, the vast majority of them I'm familiar with, or I know very well in some cases. Some of the models and the theories and things like that he talks about, I'm familiar or very familiar with a lot of those. I've never necessarily seen them assembled this way together as part of a more cogent idea about how to put things together. And that's where, to sort of preview, I think that's where the rubber hits the road with a lot of books like this on a lot of topics in life, is you have people who've thought a lot about the stuff and read a lot of the literature, but they have a unique way of sort of connecting the dots. And not everyone necessarily agrees that that's the best way to connect the dots. The studies that he cites on skill acquisition and motor development and things like that, yeah, they're pretty well established, pretty well cut and dry. Rob has a particular way of assembling them into his own argument about how the whole system kind of works together. And that's where I think, I don't want to say I disagree necessarily. I think a lot of the evidence and the argumentation makes sense to me. Where the rubber hits the road, and we can go straight for the jugular of the point that I think I'll make here today, is how that actually translates to teaching. Because really at the heart of all of this conversation is, okay, if this is how we learn, what's the job of a teacher? At least in my opinion, the job of a teacher is to facilitate learning. I can't make it happen. That has to be you, the student. That has to be in your brain. That has to be your body. That has to be there. But I can do things to sort of promote it or facilitate it. That's where all that we know about learning in any field starts to fall apart, because that's a much trickier question to answer. And it does, we can get as pedantic or not as we need to be, but it does end up asking questions of like, when we say learn better, learn what, better how, all of those other questions end up becoming really, really important for finding the real answer. Because we're taking big ideas like learning, like you asked the right question at the beginning. What the hell is that? It's a big thing. So we have to figure out, okay, learn what, for what purpose, in what context, and then what's better in those situations. That's where a lot of this will fall apart. But I say fall apart. That's where it's harder. But the studies, the references, the citations, the ideas themselves, pretty, like, I don't want to say not debated, but like pretty much most people are like, yeah, this seems about right within the field. Yeah.
All right. So one of the things to kind of get to your point that Greg and again, I don't want to speak for anybody. He's just not here to speak, and I've watched a lot of his works. Greg Souders, who's a huge proponent of not just a huge proponent. He is like the guy in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu anyway, talking about and he's very very particular about saying, look, guys, ecological dynamics is the kind of the whole sphere of things. It's more of a concept. What I'm using is constraint-led approach, which is a concept again. Robert Gray goes over in his book. He has a couple books to guide jiu-jitsu, and the way he kind of answered your question, because someone asked that, they said, well, what's a teacher supposed to do? If we can two guys can just get together in a garage and kind of like intuit their way to this thing, why is there even a coach?
Sure.
And what he said was, well, the job of the coach is actually far harder than people think it is.
Oh, yeah.
And I would even argue that, and it's maybe a different discussion or whatever, I think there's a big difference between coaching and teaching. I think there's a lot of overlap, but I think they're two completely different jobs, which is something I'm trying to write a book on, but that's going to be a ways out. So what he says, though, is like, you need to know this very, very well. And it is one thing, as I've put together constraint-led drills myself, that I have honestly gotten a far deeper understanding of some of the things that I'm trying to get through to people. Because in order to make a constraint-led drill, and to be clear for anybody watching, a constraint-led drill isn't just like, okay, you try to pass while they try to sweep or submit you. That is more just positional training. A constraint-led drill would be far more constrained than that, to the point that it's like, okay, your only job in my guard is to try to stand up. My only job is to try to not let you stand up, right? Like, that's how constraint-led drills are. And then it's like, what other constraints can I put on that to teach, to allow you to discover how to make that happen?
Sure.
Right? Like, and so like, if I'm not putting the right constraints on that will help that, then that's a failure on my part as the teacher.
Sure.
So I think it's been a very interesting thing for me.
Absolutely.
It's helped my judo. It's honestly, doing this and putting some of these drills together has helped me a lot.
Sure, yeah.
So I think there's something to it, especially on the coaching side of it. But I guess where I worry about it, and this is, so I sent you the podcast with Tom DeBlas and Big Dan and Greg, and maybe not the best example of Greg, because that, I think in that podcast he comes off a little harsh.
Sure.
They all do. Tom kind of cuts out halfway through. He's like, hey, I got to do something with my daughter. I got to go. And like, but then him and Dan kind of argue back and forth, and it's funny to read the internet, because like some people are like, Dan killed him in that argument, and other people are like, Dan didn't even understand what was going on, and it's like,
you gotta listen to Rogan. Don't read the comments.
Yeah.
Even when it's not your own video or your own post.
Yeah. It's just interesting to see the arguments on it, and because some people are just like ride or die with this thing.
Sure.
I mean, I think that goes back as far as there's people who only believe in live training, period. Like they don't want to learn. I mean, we have a number of people here who do that. They come to open mats. They rarely ever show up at class.
Sure.
And then like, they'll look to me for coaching advice or for instructional advice, and I'm like, well, this is what I recommend you do, but you realize, like, I teach all this in the classes, right? The ones you're not coming to.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's broad strokes, and I think this is where Dan made a great point, is like pitching. I think if you tell me, hey, you're pitching wrong, take your arm to a 70-degree angle and then move it through an arc at this angle, like, that's useless advice, right? Whereas if there are broad strokes, though. Hey, you have to push off the mound, you have to turn your hips, so like if I was teaching a beginner, those are the basics. And then the rest is probably, you can create little drills, like try to make the ball hit here, try to make the ball hit over here, now try to make the ball there. And it's like, I want you in your mind to recognize what changed when you made it go there.
Yes. Yeah.
How does that work?
So, I was trying to like do a 30,000 foot view and then zoom in quick.
Okay.
So, first off, in Jiu-Jitsu, this is where Jiu-Jitsu does differ a little bit from some parts of language. In Jiu-Jitsu, we are doing a lot of stuff, but also in pitching and all of it. In sports, we are doing a lot of things with our bodies that are fundamentally hard to verbalize. That transfers also over to things like ride a bicycle, like verbalize a kid getting, you know, it's like, what do you say? Just ride the bike. Like, don't not ride the bike, ride it. Balance, right? Yeah, right, that kind of thing, right? So
I'll hold it until you stay.
Yeah, there's a couple of things you can kind of coach them on verbally, but it's otherwise hard to describe. And getting your arm at the correct or most advantageous angle for a pitch or things like that can be hard to verbalize. What you are doing when you're using constraint-led approaches or these kinds of sort of situations that you set up in the classroom, what you're trying to do essentially is you're trying to get the students, the learners, to direct their attention to the correct parts of their body and how those coordinate in a way that really they can only do for themselves. And again, you're trying to facilitate that as the instructor. And when, like in the book, he talks about putting the ball under the arm and those kinds of things to kind of keep their arm at this close to the body with pitching, all those kinds of things. It's hard to, you could say 70-degree angle or whatever, but people are sitting there going like, this, you know, you're 71, no, lower it, that kind. What you need to rely on in jiu-jitsu or sports or riding a bicycle, things like that, anything that's motor kind of learning, you need to sort of direct attention to the relevant parts of the skill that they're trying to learn. And that's hard to do if you can't just verbalize it easily, or if they can't turn the verbal instructions into something easily. It's very easy to say, put your arm at a 45-degree angle. Whether or not people can do it or intuit those things, or I think one of the examples from the book was like, move a half a second faster. It was like, whoa. Even when you say in class, like, go about 50%, I'm like, I'm going to be like 47 to maybe 61. It's going to be, I don't know quite where that is, right?
Yeah, we use that all the time.
And I've been doing it for a while.
Go about 50% effort.
Yeah.
And it's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, it's a proxy for don't go full tilt.
Yeah.
But it has some utility, but the constraint-led approaches, not just in here, but in lots of areas of learning and memory, are designed to sort of limit your ability to attend to the wrong thing and focus on your ability to pay attention to the right thing. And when I say attend, we can go down that rabbit hole if you want to. What I essentially mean is the classic dictionary definition: pay attention, right? You're focused on it. All of the work kind of gets done subconsciously. Your procedural memory system kind of learns without you really being aware of what it's doing. But it does require attention. And so with the constraint-led approach, what you're trying to do is engineer these clever situations that essentially limit the focus of attention for your learner to a couple of things that you want them to have to work through. And when you can engineer those situations, they can be very, very effective. They help the teacher learn a lot, or the coach learn a lot, but they certainly help the students learn a lot. This is also true, again, not just in jiu-jitsu, not just in motor learning. We see these things in language. There's the phrase that we use in language is something we call task essential practice. And the idea is you cannot complete the drill or the activity unless you attend to the thing I definitely want you to attend to. There's no way for you to finish it otherwise. That works way better than just telling somebody, put your hand here, do this, move your hand a half a second faster at a 74-degree angle. The problem is engineering those situations, those constraint-led activities, is really fucking hard to do.
Yeah.
It's hard to generate those all the time. So when in doubt, if you're kind of trying to go quick and you don't have a way of doing it yet, the traditional way of teaching is still going to be fine. It's still going to be better than just putting guys in a garage and letting them sort of rework out how jiu-jitsu works.
We should
by itself,
probably
you know?
define that too.
Yeah.
What is traditional teaching, right?
Yeah, I would love that. You'd be far better than I would be for that.
Yeah, I think, and I think there's a few methods of traditional teaching. I would say that I hesitate to use the word oldest, but that's what I'm going to use. And that's probably not a fair way to say it because there's probably been people who didn't do it that way. So I'm using oldest in a very broad sense. But I think what most people think of when you say traditional is like, I, as the instructor, say, today we're doing arm bars from the guard. Here's what arm bar from the guard looks like. I show it 2 or 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
You all go and do it. Guys, go do 30 of these each.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me when you're done.
Sure.
And then we'll come back. And I walk around and maybe I'm like, no, your hand goes here. It must be here.
Yes.
And then, I come back and then, somehow that's supposed to translate
Mm-hmm.
to, all right, guys, go roll. Now you're going to
Yeah.
get your arm bar.
Yeah.
And what we know is that that's a very difficult transition to make.
Yes, absolutely.
Like almost impossible
Mm-hmm.
in the short term.
Right.
Like I would say it takes a very long
Sure.
time for that to work.
Yeah.
I would also argue that the constraint-led approach takes just as long, because now I have to take someone, and again, especially if you're dealing with a beginner.
Yeah.
Because now I have to take someone who doesn't know what arm bar means,
Right.
doesn't know what it looks like,
Right.
and I have to focus on a result that's not. And I think this is another important thing about constraint-led approach. And tell me if I'm getting this incorrect. Is I need to focus on, if I'm going to build a constraint-led approach, it needs to be focused on the result of the approach, not on what I need to do it. It has to be externally focused, not internally focused. Otherwise, it doesn't work as well. Is that?
Yeah, I don't have
That's
any
kind of how I've
complaints
read it.
against that. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So i.e. break their posture.
Sure, yeah.
Right. So like now it's like, how many drills do I have to put together?
Yeah.
To create an arm bar.
Mm-hmm.
Versus just showing you what an arm bar is,
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe
Yeah.
having some
Yeah.
semi-live drills and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's what in that podcast that,
Mm-hmm.
that I sent you, that's what Tom DeBlas was trying to get at, was like, hey, there's kind of a shortcut here.
Yeah.
Like I love the idea of live training
Sure.
and constrained training. I love all
Sure.
that. But sometimes it's easier just to say, put your wristwatch on the heel.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's the one that we have seen over and over again at all levels of competition works best. There's no reason for you to sit here and try to figure it out.
Yeah.
And maybe the verbal intervention
Mm-hmm.
isn't the most effective method,
Mm-hmm.
but it's at least going to give you the inspiration to be like, okay,
Yeah.
he said something about a wristwatch, like, got it.
I can remember a wristwatch, yes. Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like a quick, now,
Yeah.
again, like I think if you were to like, hey, you've got to put, it has to be on this millimeter of your wrist and
Yeah.
you have to be biting your elbow and,
Yeah.
with, 4 newtons of force, and you've got to, like that's going to be useless information too, right?
Yeah.
So, and I apologize, I'm kind of looking at film mostly.
Yeah.
I just realized I'm not really looking at the camera too much. So where am I going with that? I guess it's just like, we were talking about the traditional approach. So, it's versus, it's
Sure.
like just teaching you moves for like an hour and
Yeah.
then maybe giving you some rolling time and then you go.
Yeah.
And I'd say a more modern approach to that is kind of what we do, which is more like, I definitely teach moves,
Right.
but I also put some drills in there to help,
Right.
give you a chance to play with those moves a
Sure.
little bit, and then also let you just roll
Yeah.
because that's what everybody ultimately wants to be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas I think this constraint-led approach, the idea is that that's all you ever need.
Mhm.
And if it takes a long time, it takes a long
Yeah.
time. Jiu-Jitsu takes a long time anyway.
Yeah.
And the argument that I get is that people say it doesn't take that long, that in a shorter period of time overall, people get better.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
That's an empirical question.
Yeah.
It could be tested. I wouldn't necessarily want to just trust. I would use instructor or coach intuitions about progress as like a way of measuring. I would want them almost as though if we had 2 different schools, one coaching in the traditional way, one coaching in the constraint-led way, and then an independent blinded group of jiu-jitsu experts compares the sort of performance beforehand, performance afterwards, after whatever, a month, 2 months, a year, to see, okay, within that span who improved, and then they just blindly rate everybody, and then we can have at least some sort of objective measure that way of saying which approach works faster. But that all. Can I speak to some of the things we were just saying?
Yeah.
So
You're the expert.
no, it's cool.
I want to hear
So
you.
there's a lot. Again, there's a lot of corollaries here with things like learning a foreign language as an adult, because they all essentially rely on these same long-term learning and memory systems, because of the function of those long-term memory systems, and because of the ways that we try to exploit them as instructors or as teachers or as coaches. So the traditional approach that you described of like, here's the arm bar, is going to get the information, the sort of core information, into your brain very quickly. It's going to allow you to drill during class. It's not going to, on day one, translate into I can roll and land you in an arm bar. For the same reason that if you teach somebody who maybe they're learning Spanish as a foreign language, you teach them how many moves can, or how many pieces can the arm bar be broken down into, like 10 little sub movements. Okay, I gave you 10 words in Spanish. Go talk to somebody in Spanish. And it's like, no, that's not how that's going to work. And the roll is the same way. I'm not going to land that arm bar if they're trying to fight back, right? It's just not going to happen. But what this does, though, is this gives you an initial quick, which is what you just said and what Tom says, it gets the information to your brain kind of quickly that allows you to start scaffolding your practice so you can start building up the sort of the habits, the routines, the procedures. The constraint-led approach sort of we see it elsewhere in other parts of human learning and memory. And the idea is sort of like that quick teaching from the traditional methods and things like that, quickly getting information in your head. Some people argue within just general learning and memory research, so outside of jiu-jitsu altogether, some people argue like, that's all you need anyways. So to hell with this other stuff. I see their point because they know that what we're ultimately trying to do is build up automatic motor behaviors. And the stages of building up an automatic skill cannot be really rushed or skipped. They have to go through the same sort of steps and all those kinds of things.
How's it going?
I'm sorry, we're live on the podcast. You here for Kendall?
For class.
Okay, yeah, Kendall's in the other room. I'm sorry.
No worries.
It's okay, no worries. Just walk to the other room. I know your video probably said to come here.
We're live.
That's live. That's the way it is.
So yeah, the process of building up a motor skill, getting to your blue belt, getting to your purple belt, getting to your brown belt, black belt, all that stuff, all the stages that you have to go through of getting that completely automatic and fluid and all those kinds of things, you really can't skip steps in that process. You can't really, I would argue the evidence suggests you can't really rush it either. And rush meaning how many hours do you have to put in? Like I could put in 10 hours over one day, or I could put in 10 hours over a week. And that's going to result in slightly different curves, so to speak, of the learning curves. So we can nuance that. But the real thing here is anytime you're looking at learning and how that translates into instruction, you run into this problem because it's in everything that humans can learn or that they can teach. There is a sort of a quick way of getting information in your brain, and you can use that as a sort of crutch to help scaffold your practice in a focused way, but you still have to put in the time. The constraint-led approach is a way of saying, hey, we can build up some of those motor routines in a sort of organized fashion that keeps you from just sort of floundering like a bunch of guys just in a room by themselves figuring it out. We never want to go that far, obviously, because there's people might reinvent jiu-jitsu, but like Elio already figured out a lot of cool stuff. John Donner figured out a lot of cool stuff. So we don't need to, let's just not start from a completely blank slate. And the constraint-led approach doesn't really say that. It acknowledges that you can do some verbal things and you can set up situations for people to sort of self-discover. But the problem is, even when you do have self-discovery with the constraint-led approach, there is error. And when I say it's a problem, it's only really a problem for two reasons. One, it can slow you down. you might be doing the wrong thing longer than you would than if you just told me what to do. If you just told me how to do the armbar the correct way to begin with. And two, you run the risk of potentially cementing a bad habit if you're not getting the feedback. And the constraint-led approach is clear, to be fair. I'm not saying that doesn't say about the importance of feedback. Feedback is important. But that's something that, again, one instructor walking around a classroom, you might miss things, and all those kinds of things come up. Or if the instructor's not there to see you doing a bad habit at open mat or things like that. So
I'm glad you brought that
yeah,
up, because
yeah.
that, like, false positives was a big worry of mine.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, like, a lot of the examples
Mhm.
that Gray gives anyway
Yeah.
are one-on-one coaching examples, which I think is a big difference
Yeah.
between teaching in general and coaching, right? Coaching,
Sure.
in my mind, is this very individualized thing. Like,
Absolutely.
like you look at a football team, yeah, there's a head coach,
Yeah.
but there's a quarterback coach, there's a
Mhm.
fullback coach, there's coaches for each of these positions.
Absolutely.
And like, if I'm able to work one-on-one with you, I think maybe this is like probably all you need, and maybe a little verbal intervention, and maybe,
Sure.
but like, because I can make sure you never go down the wrong path.
Sure. Yeah.
But if I say, okay, everybody break down people, and I
Mhm.
have a guy who's, able to bench press a truck,
Yep.
and he can always just yank you down
Yep.
with most people.
Yep.
And then he goes to a tournament where everybody else is the same size and strength as him.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden this doesn't work anymore because he didn't realize he needed to use his legs.
Yeah.
Like, he's built this false positive so strongly and thought it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing is what does it mean to be right? And I think that's where that doesn't get defined. It's like,
Mhm.
what is most efficient?
Sure.
Right? Like, that's what in jiu-jitsu, what is correct. It's like,
Mhm.
what is the most efficient response? And I think you can even break that down by saying, okay, well, can I do this absent of athletics
Mhm.
to some degree?
Sure.
Right? Like, start taking power out of it.
Mhm.
You can't take strength completely out, because
of
that's
course.
how you move your body, right?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
like, but like, what's the can a smaller person do this for the most part to a larger person?
Right.
If not, I look at it as like the diaphragm choke.
Mhm.
The diaphragm choke is done from a keisagatame or a headlock position.
Yeah.
And I honestly believe it's a bullshit move that only big people can do. And everybody who's ever challenged me on it has lost, by the way. Hey, get Josh Barnett, I'm sure he'll get me. But like, if you have to pick Josh Barnett, who is definitely in the highest stratification of athlete, then does that even make a sense? You know what I mean?
No, I
That's like,
understand that,
it's
yeah.
like saying, hey, my fullback can't run like Barry Sanders. Well, nobody else could either. So
Right.
I guess we can probably just take him out of the equation and say, does he run better than most people?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that comes back to the what is right, what is wrong, and what are results, which,
Mhm.
coming back to that podcast again, was, Dan and Tom both said, well, our results are the fact that we have multiple ADCC, IBJJF world champions.
Mhm.
That's the result. And I think they were missing the forest for the trees there. I
Mhm.
think they were like looking at this high level, like,
Yeah.
that's the result. When what Greg was trying to say was, hey, the result is I broke posture.
Mhm.
That's the result we're looking at. Your guys are talking about something like way beyond
Sure.
that, which is cool.
Yeah.
We can make that a result. But
Mhm.
like, going back to what you were saying earlier with we have a constraint-led school, we have a traditional school, we have these 10 independent auditors who don't know who studied where, and say, yeah, this person, maybe they see them all on day one, and then they
Right.
see them all, 10 weeks later,
Sure.
whatever, and they say, you have clearly gotten better, you have clearly not, you
Yeah.
have clearly not, you have
Yeah.
gotten better.
Yeah.
Like, that, they're not going to be world beaters at that point, more than likely, but
Sure.
they're going to hopefully all have some clear path of improvement.
Yeah.
And what that looks like in 10 weeks, 10 months, 10
Sure.
years, who knows?
Yeah. And to the word that you keep using and that we mentioned earlier in the podcast was better. Better is, even within jiu-jitsu, better depends on lots of things. Better could be, it's ADCC. I gotta win. That's how I know I'm good. And that's a good proxy. I'm pretty sure if you won, you probably don't suck at jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
But better might just be breaking posture also. And there are different ways to get there. This book kind of points that out, which I was sort of taken aback by Greg's tone of like, this is the be all end all. It's kind of the vibe I got there, where the book even says like, different people are coming in with different goals, different outcomes in mind, different backgrounds, different bodies, different motions that they're going to be going through as they go through this constraint-led thing. So what constitutes better is just a tricky word to work with. And so I think a lot of those guys talking past each other was different conceptualizations of better. I do think there's a valid point in clearly the whatever method Tom uses for instruction, for coaching, it doesn't not work. Like, it's clearly worked. A reasonable question that I think no one's asking is, can this improve on it, essentially? Would you have more ADCC qualifying individuals in your gym if you did this either instead of or in addition to traditional approaches? Would you have maybe only one who gets there with the traditional approach, and maybe the constraint-led approach also only gives you one, but that guy's clearly leaps and bounds better than the one that you had before, you know? There's different kinds of ways that something could be better. For what it's worth, in the literature on learning and memory and education and how these things track into teaching, instruction, and coaching and things like that, the sort of advice that I always give other teachers is the traditional approaches, part of the reason why they're traditional is because they don't necessarily not work, right? A lot of, not all, a lot of teachers, instructors, coaches, kind of after they've done it for a while, have an intuitive sense of what they should be doing, right? I certainly think that you're that way. Like, you have an intuitive, like, did you get your PhD in educational psychology? No, but you have a sort of intuitive sense of like, am I connecting with you and helping you connect the dots so you can do the thing? Some instructors don't have that. Maybe they shouldn't be instructors or things like that, but like, that's fine. But clearly, years of use of traditional approaches to teaching anything, to coaching anything. Part of the reason why they become traditional is because like people go, hey, that got me where I was trying to go. That got me to excel to the point that I wanted to get to. The real question is, could this improve it? Could this make things better? And if so, better how? And what's an important question that's left out of all this is, what's the best bang for my buck also? I can get into top level right now with my stupid ass schedule about 2 days a week. And so constraint led for me, and you're let's say I'm a white belt, right? You're starting from scratch.
To be clear, Phil's we didn't talk about that. You've been training for like 6 years now.
Something like that. Yeah.
It's a pretty skilled purple belt.
I'm okay. But yeah, I mentioned I'm a white belt. Coming in 2 days a week, that traditional approach is going to get me farther faster at the level of having some knowledge of the game. It will not get me beating Jeremy Parton, right? Nothing will, but like, that's not going to do it. But it's not necessarily because of the instruction type. It's because I've not put the time in. If you combine the traditional instruction with the time in, you're going to be good, right? There will be degrees of good, right? Some ADCC champions, some not, but you will get really, really good. With the constraint-led approach, if you do not put in the time, you will not get good. Like I said earlier, the skill acquisition process for learning motor skills cannot really be rushed, in the sense that you can't just skip steps and suddenly be amazing. You have to put in the time. So really, the differences I think in these approaches where the rubber hits the road is, what does your student need? What are you trying to do as a coach? Are you training people for competition? Are you just training somebody like me who's a professor who, you know, wants to be able to take care of himself if somebody jumps me at a gas station, right? How do I get Phil to where he needs to be for his goals as efficiently as possible, as quickly as possible? And so that's where these will end up differing slightly, because some baseline level of knowledge that you can get from the traditional approach can allow you to, in some ways, do some things more efficiently or earlier in your development. But at the end of the day, with either of these approaches, if you're not putting the time in, let's say loosely, to drill or repeat or practice or do a constraint-led thing, if you're not putting that time in, neither of these by themselves will just, 2 hours a week of a constraint-led approach isn't going to be infinitely better than 2 hours a week of the traditional approach. I think what we're really talking about here, and maybe this is part of your point, is if we're talking about coaches like yourself, like Tom, like Greg, these guys aren't worried about necessarily the people who only come for 2 hours a week.
And to be clear, all these guys are far more successful than me. I'm taking no credit on it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So what? I guess
So this is really down to This is really down to high level skill, is what
Yeah.
I think, and I think that's why the argument is so severe, is because there is a lot at stake.
There was, I think, and that's something I wanted to ask about as well. Is so if we, is it fair to say that skill can generally be put on a bell-shaped curve?
Tell me more about skill and the bell.
Okay, fair enough.
Because there's one question I think you might be asking, and the answer is no. And if it's
Okay.
a different question, I want to make sure I've got it.
So
down.
the bell-shaped curve,
Yep.
and like generally like in the middle you have your average people,
Okay.
people who are average
Yes.
good. At the far
Sure.
stratification would
Yes.
be your ADCC
Yeah.
champions, your Gordon
Yes.
Ryans.
Yeah.
So is it fair to put it on that?
It's definitely a bell. I'm not sure that the bell's in the middle,
Fair enough.
right? It might, if this is Gordon Ryan, the bell might be down here and kind of tapers way out, or it might be closer to the middle. I'm not sure, but it's essentially a bell-shaped. There's going to be a bulk of people who are in this sort of average zone.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's going to be outliers on both sides.
Okay. So I think, I don't know, I guess I tend to, and maybe it's because I don't run an ADCC gym, I mean, nobody here is planning to go to ADCC or anything like that. They want to be very good, but they don't necessarily feel, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm even the right person to get them there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I tend to cater and think of my training as like, well, let's eliminate the worst possible outcome, which is a person who trains for 10 years and still has zero skill, and the highest possible outcome, which is your Marcelo Garcias,
Sure.
your Gordon Ryans, your like both of those things are highly unlikely to happen,
Mm-hmm.
but you can still get pretty damn good at jiu-jitsu
Mm-hmm.
and be a very knowledgeable, very skillful person
Absolutely.
who none of your friends want to wrestle around with because
Sure.
you just murder them.
Sure. Yeah.
Not actual murder, YouTube. Is it fair to say, like, kind of taking those out of account, like out of the results in general, is like, look, I'm glad that that's your result. I'm glad that's where you want to end up, but let's just learn to break posture for now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I mean, it has to be jiu-jitsu, again, in the ways that it's like language or other motor skill learning, like being a quarterback in the NFL or something, is a complex assembly of stuff, and you have to break it down at some level. You have to say, okay, we're just going to focus on this, improving this part here, and a lot of the studies that are cited in this book are studies that are like that. They are getting a baseball player to swing effectively, efficiently, appropriately. That's great, but that's only one part of the job, right? And so you have to have focused training on swinging. You have to have focused training on running the bases. You have to have focused training on stealing bases. You have to have focused training on catching. Just the physics and the psychology and the neuroscience of how we catch a ball is insane, right? So it's a lot of things that you have to, each one has to have its own dedicated time for instruction, whatever kind of instruction you're using. And that's where I think that thorny word of repetition ends up being a kind of an issue. But yeah.
I want to add something, and this might be throwing a huge monkey wrench in.
Sure.
I don't know.
Let's do it.
But I feel like the constraint-led approach requires some level of, well, probably a high level of thoughtfulness in your training.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's something that intelligence would play a huge part in, right? Like
Hmm.
the ability to problem solve. So
yeah, problem solving certainly is going to be a part of it. And problem solving skills can be learned. So it's not necessarily like we talk about people having like talents and stuff like that. And at some level, they kind of do. But a lot of that stuff is learned and is what's the word? Sort of has like a snowball effect. My ability to problem solve, like if you left me to my own devices in a constraint-led activity, now I am going to get way more out of that than I did 6 years ago, because I know enough that my attention is sort of tuned to certain pieces of information. Um, I will be able to problem solve better. I will be able to learn independently better. So learning is this kind of thing in any domain where the more learning you do in that skill, the easier it is to learn more information within that skill down the line. This is in reverse with how is it working?
yeah, it's
Yeah,
working.
yeah.
I was just seeing if there's
This
comments.
contrasts with how much left there is to learn.
That's what I need. Nope. Okay.
So like, as a case in point, if someone wanted to teach you something, you Bill, a brand new jiu-jitsu thing, new technique, you've never seen it before, you're going to learn it faster now as an expert than you would have when you started off as a white belt. But because you're an expert, there are way fewer things for you to learn, right? It's like the ghost escape's not new to you. So as you get better, you can learn faster within whatever it is that you're learning, jiu-jitsu in this particular case. There's also less for you to learn. So there's this sort of weird paradox at super high levels. And that's what makes, when Tom and Greg and those guys are hard to parse what they are thinking or where their ideas are coming from, because they're specifically talking about people at an extremely high level. When this stuff gets when the CLA versus traditional approach gets scaled down to what does my jiu-jitsu academy do in this town with these students, Greg has some great arguments, Tom has some great arguments, but how well those track here, how well those track with people like me, I'm just a university professor, I don't want to get my ass kicked, like, it's totally a different set of priorities.
Mhm.
And those priorities again cycle back into that whole like what's better for who in what context. Like, I'm not a competitor, so those things don't come up for me necessarily.
Well, I think Greg actually said something in that I liked, was you move relative to the context in which you're asked.
Yes.
So like your context as you as a human is,
Yeah.
I don't want to get my ass kicked.
Yes.
Like, your context isn't, can I win ADCC?
Right.
Your context is, some dude tries to punch me.
Yep.
Some kid's mad that you gave him an F.
Yeah.
Gave him.
If I gave
that he
them an
earned
F, they earned it because
Yeah.
I'm an easy teacher.
that they earned an F and wants to hit you,
Yeah.
and you can just like move out of the way and,
Yeah.
and just like grab them and be like, you
Dude,
don't,
please, let's not
don't
do
do
this.
this.
Yes.
Like, just go back to your seat.
Yes.
You made a mistake.
Yes.
Let's move on from here.
Exactly.
Right, which is kind of how I see you doing it. Be like, now, before you, like, I see you being like so chill.
I'd probably
Some
still
guy
get in
tries to
trouble
slap
just
you in
for
the
that
face. Like,
case.
yeah, you'd be like, oh, okay, now we're
Yeah.
gonna sit down.
Yeah.
And then you get in trouble.
Yeah, it's still getting in trouble.
But anyway, so yeah, I wondered about that, because I feel like there's been times that the answer was right in front of me, and I'll ask Peter Sauer, I'll be like, hey, I keep getting hit with this option and this move,
Yeah.
and I'm really not sure how to stop it. And he'll be like, oh, just put your arm like this.
Mhm.
And I think that also goes back to, like, as an expert, I can immediately pick that up.
Yeah.
That verbal cue
Mhm.
is immediately mine now.
Yeah.
Like, I don't forget it. And I apologize, guys, for the background noise if that's too loud. Next to us, we have we're sitting in our office right now, and next to us is a center that takes care of children with developmental disabilities, so that they don't have a lot of control sometimes. So, but there's a class going on in the other room, so this is just the best we had at the moment. So, please give them some grace for that. Yeah, so like I feel like, man, am I just a dummy for not seeing it, or maybe I just needed to spend more time in the problem and I would have come up with it myself. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the problem, is that you'll never know. Once you've been given the answer, you don't know if you could have ever figured it out another way, right?
Sure. Yeah.
I think some people probably could have.
Yeah.
I think if you put Gordon Ryan in the same situation, someone who's more savvy a grappler probably naturally than I will ever be, he probably would have figured it out. He'd have been like, "Oh, just don't let him grab your neck, bro." Like I don't even use gi and I can see it. Okay, man, sorry. I say that he was actually I did a seminar with him. He was super nice. But anyway, like that's something that I look at too, is like, well, how much can I reasonably expect the average person to figure out on their own?
Yeah.
Versus me just saying, hey, put the heel on the wristwatch.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think, to Greg's credit, he doesn't say that's wrong. He doesn't say that can't work. He just says it's not the optimal way to coach somebody. That won't always get you the result that you're hoping it gets.
Yeah.
And that some of that is just them being happy you gave them the answer. Yeah. And even though they can't apply that answer.
Sure. And that's where though, and this is the same thing for the word better, optimal has to be understood by both the learner and the coach. What is better, what is optimal, does depend on the context and the people involved. And so where the rubber hits the road with all of this stuff is the situations that you're trying to get your students to succeed in are going to change, and that's going to therefore change the requirements of what you can and can't teach them or coach them. If rapid basic understanding of core ideas is the goal, constraint-led is not going to get you there without very, very clever designing of very, very clever constraint-led activities. That might mean that for you to get your students where they need to be with the traditional approach means that for you're prepping for class, you're prepping to teach a class or coach or whatever. If you do the traditional approach, the thing not you specifically, but that people have been doing for a long time, okay, I need to prepare for maybe it takes me 15 minutes to prep what I'm going to do in class today, and I'm going to get them where they need to go because they just need a basic fundamental understanding of here's what an armbar looks like. Eventually you'll see it from all different angles, and you'll see it when you're upside down and when they're upside. But for right now, you need to understand just basically there's a mechanic where we don't want the arm to bend a certain way. We want it to bend the other way, right? Or whatever. 15 minutes, you're ready to go for class. You got things to do. Tom's got things to do. Greg's got things to do. It's fine. It'll get the students where they need to be, and it frees you up to do whatever else you need to do with your day, which includes running a business, right? On the flip side, if you want to promote this sort of constraint-led approach, which has plenty of merits and is based on sound science of learning, that's cool. But that one class may now not be 15 minutes of prep. That one class may be 15 hours, maybe 15 days, 15 8-hour days, maybe even longer for just the one class. How critical is it that you take that time to do that? How critical is it for your students? How critical is it for you and your business? Is it even possible? Some people don't have that time, that luxury, right? A lot of instructors, it's not their only job. You know what I mean? But again, for people like Tom, that is his full-time, complete devotion, right? Gordon Ryan's in the gym 7 freaking days a week with John Donner doing this stuff. They can take the time to do those things. But that's why I always say that this stuff with Jiu-Jitsu, constraint-led versus traditional approaches, I've seen it everywhere. When it comes to trying to train or coach people or teach people and knowing the learning science, they don't just map onto each other in a nice, neat way. How we know learning works and what we want for our learners is a complicated dance between those things. And so that's why I think a lot of the sort of dichotomous argumentation, certainly in that podcast, was sort of missing that bigger picture. If that makes
Well, yeah,
sense.
and I mean, I think you see it more broadly in jiu-jitsu as well. For example, in the Paris-Sauer Association, we have curriculums, right? We have
Yeah.
a white to blue curriculum.
Yeah.
Broadly have a purple belt and brown belt curriculum. And what I mean by that, for anybody who maybe doesn't know, is I do make you show me your game as a purple belt. And so it's not like show me armbar, it's show me how you get to an armbar.
Mhm.
Like, and which, kind of lends itself to that constraint-led approach by that
Mhm.
point, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Which is kind of what you're saying. The more expert you are, the easier that kind of thing becomes.
yeah. You can also engineer them for yourself
Yeah.
at a certain point. You can self-teach in that way.
hmm and then there's a curriculum for brown and black belt, which is the Elio Gracie master text, which again, whether someone likes or dislikes that is another story altogether. But that's what it is for the Painter Sauer Association. So this leads me to like I know I've heard Greg say, and a lot of people who are constraint led, they only care about essentially, can I tap you out,
Right.
right? Like, and as a teacher, that's really bizarre to me, because that means that, like, I've seen it over time, multiple times, people who make it through white, blue, purple, brown belt, IBJJF, and then get to the worlds with this incredible world-beating triangle. Ryan Hall's a great example of it.
Mhm.
They called him Ryangle up into that point. He was tapping everybody, and then he gets there, and it turns out all of those guys have world-beating triangle chokes, and his is not special anymore,
Yeah.
and he doesn't really do anything at that
Mhm.
level. And I've seen it over and over and over again, where it's like, because there was no guidance to, hey, you need to add this. And I think we could call that a failure of coaching. We
Sure.
could call it anything we want. Maybe it's a failure. Maybe the coaches were telling him all the time, hey, dude,
Right. Yeah.
start the leg locks now. Because
Sure.
let's be honest, he ended up going to MMA and doing great.
Mhm.
Got great leg locks, great fit.
Yeah.
I'm not shitting on
No.
on Ryan Hall.
It's not
But
easy to heel hook BJ Penn.
no, the man's phenomenal.
Yeah.
But he's just an example of someone who's I've seen do that, and I see it a lot. People will be good. I actually was just working with one of our students, a brown belt that we have, and I was like, hey, to get to black belt, I really need you attacking more than just a Peruvian necktie on me.
Right.
Like, that's all I have to look out for. I'm going to turtle up. You're going to Peruvian necktie. I'm going to defend it, and then you're going to have nothing else. Like,
Gotcha.
you need to have something on my arm, something on my leg. Like,
Yeah.
that's what you're missing.
Yeah.
And so I feel like this constraint-led approach, and if all you care about is can they tap people out,
Yeah.
they're going to focus on just tapping people out
Yeah.
and
That's-
not getting
that's a fair
better in a
point.
holistic way.
Yeah.
And I guess the question is, does that matter? And to some people it doesn't, clearly. To me it does. As a teacher, I want you to know the art of jiu-jitsu, not just how to tap people out.
Sure.
In fact, because tapping people out isn't even always the goal, right? I work with
Right.
a lot of police. You like,
Yeah.
if you broke someone's arm as a university professor, you would lose your job.
Yep.
Right? Like it would you just wouldn't work there anymore.
Yeah.
It just can't happen.
Yeah.
Right? So like for you, the answer, like your tap out in a real situation, if a student attacks you, assuming there's no weapon or something
Yeah.
involved, is you just make sure you don't get your ass kicked. And you're trying to do it in as gentle a way as
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah.
To
Make sure I'm
hopefully-
okay. Make sure no one else
yeah,
is getting
to
hurt.
hopefully not
Yeah.
lose your job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
or it's a kid at school.
Mhm.
Like, you can't just go choke someone unconscious.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, he needs to do this with some forethought. In fact,
Yeah.
the way we teach them is like, hey, if you end up using something like this on a kid at school, they're not going to know what a tap is.
Yeah.
They're going to start screaming and yelling. You need to know that's when you stop.
Right. Right.
Like, that's their tap.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's why verbal tap is really important to understand.
Yeah.
When you're working with police officers,
Mhm.
they can't break someone's. I mean, it's not that they can't, but most of the time they're not looking to break your arm. They're looking to put you on your belly and get your hands behind your
Yeah.
back. It's a very different type
Yeah.
of
They
movement.
want you to safely stop doing the thing you're doing, and
Yeah.
they want to be safe in the process. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
a lot of these things change depending, again, on the context,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, and that's really important. So I think if the only goal is can you tap someone out, you're really missing a lot of jiu-jitsu.
Sure.
I think you're missing a huge portion.
Yeah.
That's just my jiu-jitsu philosophy. Feel free to flame me in the comments if you want. But I think the next question on this, and I apologize, we're about an hour. Are you still okay on time?
Yeah.
Okay. The debate always comes back to the idea that repetitive drilling, not just drilling. So I want to define what I mean by this.
Yeah.
Is like, hey, I think there's that, and it's I'll get to where it came, or where I've seen it come from. This idea that if I drill 1,000 times, I'm going to be good at something, right? Which comes, I think, from Malcolm Gladwell's work, where he looked at people entering Juilliard, and the minimum number of hours that to get into Juilliard was about 1,000 hours of playing, right? And it's like, when you really look at that, it's like, well, don't forget that didn't make him an expert. That was the minimum number to get into Juilliard.
Yeah.
So they're really good, but they're still not considered an expert. They're just getting in.
Yeah.
And so, what role does repetition like that play, if any, in learning?
Yeah.
And how can we make it optimal?
Yeah. So
Again, with the optimal word, right?
yeah. There's
Too many, so many branches.
There's pitfalls everywhere there, but yeah. So the 1,000 hours idea, or 10,000 hours idea.
Yeah, it was 10,000. Right?
Yeah. Broadly speaking, it is easiest, and I think correct to say, yeah, there's a certain, probably not a specific number, because it's going to vary slightly with certain things. I'm in my 40s. Jeremy's not. His 10,000 hours probably look different than my 10,000 hours.
For anybody wondering, Jeremy's a 5-year black belt.
Yeah.
Very good.
He's quite good. Yeah. So like, and I'm not just talking about like the spacing of the hours necessarily, but just there are other attributes. His focus in class versus my focus in class. His spacing of his practice is much more dense than mine is. All those are like other variables that are going to play a role. Physical, just talent, right, is going to differ from person to person. Those are all going to cause some fluctuations in that 10,000 hours number, or whatever the number would actually be. But broadly speaking, for something like jiu-jitsu, yeah, you need a lot of repetition. Repetition doesn't guarantee success, but it may be a minimal requirement, a necessary thing.
Okay.
And so you can have 100 people who put in the time, the repetitions, and they all put it in the right way, but maybe there's still variation from person to person in their performance, their actual success. Now, repetition of what is really important, and that always gets neglected. In jiu-jitsu and in foreign language teachers, right, which I work a lot with them, it's the classic drill and kill. Just go into the corner and do 30 arm bars. That's not rolling. It is going to build up your arm bar technique in that particular position with that particular person in this particular situation. I can't remember exactly what Rob Gray word he uses to describe it. He might just say variability in repetition. But the idea is you want repetition that's focused, drill and kill, do 30 arm bars in the corner to get the information into the head and to make it a little bit resistant to forgetting.
As you were saying before, it's the scaffolding.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to have that sort of slow focused instruction at first. Here's the basic mechanic, here's the basic movement. And the idea is that drilling is going to sort of take you from, I heard it once and then I forgot it immediately, to, I heard it once, I practiced it enough that it's a little more resistant to me forgetting. But you don't want to just be able to do an arm bar from closed guard with your one person, your one partner. You do need to train
In a static situation.
In a static situation, right? That will help you in that one situation. And you want people to learn the whole art of jiu-jitsu. You want people to, you don't know what your ADCC opponent's necessarily going to do. They have clearly a good game. And they're probably not just one-sided. So you need to have the repetition, not just of a single move in a drill and kill fashion, but you need to have the repetition that comes from focused play. And that could be the constraint-led narrow activities. That's also very focused rolling. That's rolling that is sometimes positional. Let's just work this thing in this context. But those are all, again, those are narrow. You also need repetition of just essentially the chaos of a roll. You have to have repetition of, I hate to say it, but like all of the things in order to build up a full, complete skill set. What does repetition do? Repetition does not get the information into your head to begin with. Repetition automatizes the information that you already have. It makes it automatic. It makes it fluid, fluent, effortless, hopefully. But your opponent has something to say about that. So that doesn't mean repetition of your arm at 71 degrees versus 72 degrees. It's repetition of the sort of task at hand, which is armbar them. And so, again, to the point that Rob makes, variability in your learning is important, but it doesn't mean that you should never repeat an action because that somehow just raw repetition is bad. Raw repetition is important. Raw repetition is how you go from having to stop and go, how do I say this word again? To boom. Raw repetition is how you go from, how do I do an armbar again? To, I didn't even think about doing the armbar. But suddenly I find myself doing an armbar. Repetition is how you, I'm sure you've had this experience. You guys have probably had it too. You're driving home from work, you get home and you go, how did I get here? Like, I was thinking about other stuff, but I was on autopilot in essence, right?
Yeah. And you were still paying attention.
You were still attending.
But you're not going to remember that
Yeah.
there was a dog walking on the side of the road halfway through. Like, that's one of those. I see people play mind games with people, and they're like, "Oh, do you know?" They'll show you a video, and like, "Oh, did you notice the gorilla?" Or
No,
whatever.
right,
It's like,
yeah,
no,
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't notice the gorilla. But why would I? Like, why would that even be there?
Right.
You know, and that's the point of it. Is like,
Sure.
But they try to make it sound like you weren't paying attention. It's like,
Sure.
it doesn't necessarily mean that.
Yeah.
You told me to count the basketballs. You
Yeah.
didn't tell me to look out
Yeah.
for a gorilla.
Yeah, and we could go deep dive into the like how attention works because there's different sort of you can attend to things without actually being consciously aware of the fact that you're doing it. There's some really cool studies out there on that stuff. But yeah, so like the repetition, I don't quite know how it ended up in this context. Got kind of a bad rap. It's still repetition at the end of the day. The constraint-led approach is not going to say like, okay, we did 1 hour of constraint-led arm barring. Now you're a black belt level arm barrer.
Right.
You're still going to have to repeat that.
You're still going to miss it a million times.
Yeah, exactly. So you can't get away from that.
Or 1,000.
Yeah.
Or however many.
Yeah. What counts
Don't
as
quote me on a million.
what counts as a
I'm the
good
dummy.
what counts as a good repetition depends on a lot of factors. But for something as complicated as jiu-jitsu, you need lots of repetition of all the things in all the different contexts. And that just requires time too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go somewhere with that. Well, let's take the, and I apologize. I meant to go somewhere with that, and it was repetition, and I'll come back to it if I remember it.
Cool.
But another thing I wanted to ask was, like, when I talk to people about jiu-jitsu and learning jiu-jitsu, one of the things I talk about is kind of like, it's like learning the alphabet, and then you know, learning to put it together into sentences,
Sure.
and then learning.
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel like maybe that's a misnomer, because I start thinking about, well, how do we really learn to read? And the fact that we even that like most of the population knows how to read is amazing, right? If you look just like 200 years ago, that was a rare thing.
Yeah.
But that aside, like, it really started when I was sitting on my mom's lap and she was reading me some dumb book, right? Like,
Sure.
she would point at the words and
Sure,
read
sure.
it, read
Yeah, yeah.
along, and there's a big picture of Mickey Mouse or whatever,
Yeah.
right? Like, so like it was far before preschool said apple, right? Like,
Sure.
so, and I would assume that jiu-jitsu to some degree is like that, like just watching, you know, like I'm on day one, I've never done this before, which is something that I didn't truly have an experience of with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I can imagine anybody who did, like, you just learned whatever, you learned how to upa someone off of you, and then you're sitting here watching your people roll, and you're like, oh, okay, there's things that they're doing. I don't know what any of them are, but I at least see them. It's kind of like we're pointing at these scribbles on a page,
Yeah.
and then mom's saying words
Yeah.
that kind of make sense, but there's a cool picture with it, which is
Mhm.
like this. Oh wow, it's cool to watch
Sure.
them do this.
Yeah.
Like, how much does that play a part?
Um,
I know there again. I threw
yeah.
a few things.
No,
in.
yeah. So any kind of, and again, this is true for just about anything as far as I know. Any kind of input is better than no input. And when I say input, what I mean is input could be watching, you've never done jiu-jitsu a day in your life and you're watching some guys roll. You're watching somebody slowly walk through how to do a rear naked choke on somebody else. It could just be visual input. You're not doing it. You will still learn from that. It's still better than nothing at all. You could also just make the input, hey, you two guys don't know any jiu-jitsu at all. Here's the mats. You sign the waiver and figure it out. That's still better than nothing too, compared to Mr. Couch Potato, who just never bothers to get any input at all. Mm-hmm. I've never thought about physical motion, competition, violence, anything like that. I've never seen it. I've never tried it. I'm a static human entity with none of that. So all of that's better than nothing. The thing about learning a motor skill, which jiu-jitsu is a complex of motor skills, the thing about that is there's not a lot of transference. So if you just watch, you will get good at visually identifying what's happening, but not necessarily doing it. If you just do it, you'll presumably get better at doing it, but not necessarily visually recognizing it in others. There's merit to both of them. And of course, the goal of teaching and coaching and all those things is to engineer all the situations you need to put all those pieces together. But yeah, there's something to a sort of a precursor, certainly by the time kids are learning to read, they already know the language in a lot of ways. It's just that they've not done the reading portion of it yet. They've been speaking for years at that point. But seeing their, somebody else read to them or looking through a picture book with them and all those kinds of things, it is starting to put the picture together before they get to the real meat of reading themselves. And we see that in jiu-jitsu. Like when guys come in here and they wrestled in high school, I'm like, whoa. Like, you are not a newbie at this process, right?
You've handled another person.
You are very different than me, who's been in like 2 fights in my entire life when I was a teenager. Like, that's different. And they were not good fights anyway, right? So like, not there's ever a good one. But yeah, that kind of prior knowledge that you bring to a situation can act as an accelerator for the initial learning process, can kind of get the information into your head quicker. It can accelerate you through the learning if it's really similar. And that's in part because you've kind of already learned it, right? Wrestlers come in here and they've already learned hips, you know what I mean? They've already learned that. So it's like, well, they're not really learning it now. They're just refining it in the context of jiu-jitsu. And that's one of those cases where you can rush skill acquisition, where you can rush skill learning, because in essence, it's kind of already been learned over here, and you're just sort of reapplying it or re-engineering it into a new situation. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think it does.
Those are two different things too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the issue here, is that there's a lot that, the argument becomes constraint-led approach, only way, constraint-led approach, bullshit.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I mean, I think there's room for,
Yeah.
I think there's room for nuance here, my friends.
Yeah.
The consummate in the middle kind of person.
I'm the same. And I have to say there is important truth in the middle, because this is very much, some of it, I could debate a couple little minor things. Some of the things he words too strongly for what the evidence is, but this is more or less how people learn motor skills. That doesn't mean that the constraint-led approach itself is the best way to accelerate or finesse or facilitate the learning process. That's his proposed way, that's Greg's proposed way. But just because we know how people learn doesn't exactly mean we can automatically map that into the best, optimal, better, whatever those sneaky words are, training conditions. And that's true of anything that we know about learning on the one hand and teaching or instruction on the other side. You do get into way messier waters over here. This is easy to engineer. We can study this very controlled. I've been doing it in my lab for a decade. But that's also in my lab with people like pushing buttons on a computer or whatever, right? Scaling that into, okay, how do I teach them this stuff? That's where it gets trickier. And that's why I think the constraint-led versus traditional approach dichotomy, or this is all there is, or this is total bullshit. It's kind of missing that nuance in the transition from learning to teaching.
So let's take that to a conversation that you and I have had several times. That kind of starts with the outdated theories of like auditory learners and visual learners and all that stuff, which has kind of been, I hesitate to use the word disproven, but we know that's not really is disproven.
I think it's disproven. I don't have any strong problems with it, but it's certainly the evidence is not in its favor.
I know that in my original instructor, so I have an instructor training manual. In my original instructor training manual, someone said Jiu-Jitsu has no point of view. Good morning, Mr. Whitney. Jiu-Jitsu is process. I mean, I think that's true.
Everything is.
Everything is a process. Yeah. I mean, you're not wrong. Those, because Tom brings that up a little bit in his, and like, that's kind of an old thought process. But you and I were talking, and what you kind of broke it down to, and I'm going to paraphrase you, but please make it better, is that what that really broke down to, through research was, it's more fun for people to learn in certain ways. And when learning is fun, you tend to remember it better.
Yeah. So
I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. So, learning being fun, basically, and there's different ways to be fun. And trust me, I know that when I think I'm being fun, some of my students agree and some of them don't. But when learning is fun, essentially it acts as a draw on attention. It makes you pay deeper attention, makes you more likely to integrate what you're learning with what you already know, which is going to help cement the information into your brain, make it easier to pull back out when you need it later. When learning is fun, it enhances motivation. Motivation makes you more likely to put yourself into a situation where you're going to do more learning. Motivation kind of works for two reasons. One is if you're motivated, you're more likely to continually do things, continually do jiu-jitsu, which is going to help you learn through repetition and all that other stuff. And the other reason is because it focuses, maybe focus isn't the right word, it enhances your attention and your willingness to tie in what you're learning with what you already know. That really is the recipe for successful learning and retention, is focused attention, integrating what you're currently getting with what you already know, and then some sort of repetition broadly defined, so that it becomes permanent and easy and automatic.
Okay, and the reason I bring it up, because I think it really comes down to what's truly going on here, is I mean, we have a bunch of people in my academy. I'm very fortunate in that way. And we have some people who love repetition. They will drill by the numbers, like military style, like 1, 2, 3, like that they love doing it that way. They think that's fun. I think that is dull as hell, but they love doing it.
Sure.
And they will do it over and over and over again. And they're good. They're, Eric is one of my black belts, very skilled guy.
Yeah.
But that's how he loves drilling.
Yeah.
Or loves training. There are people who I've mentioned before who love to just roll.
Yep.
There are people who really love the constraint-led stuff that we do, and there's people who like the mix.
Yeah.
And people who like kind of just being shown moves and then they get to go play with them.
Yeah.
I feel like that's what's really playing in here, is that if I'm Greg Souders, who has he's a very successful academy as well, and like if I'm him and people come in and they see that this is how they're training, well, that's going to draw people who seem to enjoy learning that way. So of course they're going to excel at
self-selection.
You know what I mean? And I think every academy does that.
Sure.
I think every school does that, right? Like you enjoy the place you're at,
Absolutely.
so therefore you're going to learn well in the
Mhm.
process you're in.
Sure.
And then there's also the nature of people to be tribal.
Yeah.
So you're like, well, I learn well here, therefore it must be good.
Right. Right.
And it's like,
Yeah.
I feel like that's what's really playing into it.
Sure.
And this is why it's such a heated debate, which is bizarre to me that anybody, like,
Yeah.
recently people have just gotten so emotional over every topic.
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
just weird. But
Yeah.
but that's a whole different
I'm surprised we're
discussion.
not fighting it. Actually. Yeah.
But I don't know. I feel
Yeah.
like that self-selection, as you put it, is playing a huge part in this.
And it definitely cements their views. Tom is where he is because of, in part, that self-selection process, or of training people who seem to like vibe with that and who succeed, obviously, clearly. And Greg feels the same way. Greg did have some comment early in the podcast, and I don't remember where it was, and I'm paraphrasing it probably poorly, but where he was sort of like, "Look, bitches, this is the science." And I don't ever like that approach, because it kind of comes off to me as, it sounds like, the kid who knows one piece of knowledge but they think they know all of it, or they kind of sort of appeal to authority there that I don't like. You need to be able to explain why this works or why it doesn't, kind of calmly, without just saying, I know this stuff and it's science.
Yeah, and to be fair to him, that's the podcast I sent you, just because it was popular and it was trending.
Right, that's
There
the
he
only
has
one I've seen.
plenty of
Yeah.
others
Yeah.
where he's quite calm,
Maybe a gem of a
very
guy, I have no
collected.
idea. Yeah.
I've never met the man. I would love to sit down and talk to him, actually, not to debate him,
Yeah.
but to understand.
Sure. Yeah.
That would be my goal. It would be like, and I'm sure he's probably tired of giving that podcast because there's like 100 of them that he's done it for. But like, I'd like to sit down and talk to him. Hey, how do you teach an armbar? And I don't know what his answer would be. Maybe it would be like, why does it have to be an armbar?
Sure. Yeah.
Like all they need to do is tap, right? Jiu-Jitsu is serious play directed toward. Jiu-Jitsu says there's always hidden premise, always searching, underlying, influencing, obviously yet hidden. Cool.
Yeah. So I think that's why those guys.
Reading the comments.
I do think that's why those guys get so entrenched, at least in part, on those ideas. The real, like I said, if I had like one takeaway of all of this, broadly speaking, the constraint-led approach, the stuff that Greg's talking about, the stuff that's in this book, is, yes, based on valid, good, solid science. That does not necessarily easily translate into what do we do at top level? What do we do at all the different jiu-jitsu schools around the world? And that's always a problem when you look at learning research and how that translates into, okay, what do I do as an instructor, as a coach, as a coach or as a teacher? And I know that problem inside out because that's how I sort of spent my career. Like I was brought to Kent State University to say, here's how learning works so that I could help train teachers. And the first, 5-6 years was just this brick wall of not being able to communicate with one another, because of how hard it is to make that transition from figuring out, okay, if I know learning works this way, how can I optimize the teaching methods to fit that? And if you actually look at the evidence that Rob cites in his book, he's got a table of, I think it's constraint-led, and there's another one, DL, I can't remember what that stood for. Sort of essentially his proposed ways of teaching versus other ways of teaching. There have been maybe like 10 studies done on it, and about 6 showed that approach worked better, and about 5 didn't show anything. He's like, so that's pretty good evidence. It's like, it's pretty good, but it's also close to a coin flip. There's not as much work on that, though. That's really where you need the work. You need studies. Studies on learning as a learning person are great, and I can nerd out and do that 10 ways a Sunday. You need studies on instruction. You need studies on coaching. You need studies that evaluate objectively with this group of learners, with this coach, this teacher, this instructor, this trainer, what techniques work better. And if I could steal from the educational research on learning various things, from math all the way up to gymnastics, it's complicated. And I know that's kind of the weasel shit answer, but it's rarely ever the case that one method is just clearly outshines everything else in all contexts. And that's where it's also important, I think, for coaches and instructors to have a sensitivity to what does this context require. I've got 5 minutes to teach Phil, a heel hook. Is the constraint-led approach the right way to go with 5 minutes? Like, I don't know that ever comes up, but you know what I mean? Like, that's just, it's not going to work. It's like, put the wristwatch on the heel and that's it. Or, straight ankle or whatever that you're doing there. But yeah, does that track?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And I mean, it's the approach I take for sure. Is like I just try to combine as many different known useful methods of teaching as I can.
Tools in a toolbox.
And some days I'll probably lean more toward one than the other.
Yeah.
But I feel like overall it produces a pretty good student.
Yeah.
And like I don't know if any of my guys would ever do well in high level competition because I don't ever have anybody who's interested in that.
Right.
But I also don't market to that either.
Sure.
It's just not what we do.
Yeah.
Everybody that we have that does local competitions does fine. Some win, some lose, some get first place, some get second. They do pretty damn good.
Right.
But a lot of guys just have no interest in that. They're like you. They've got a 40-hour job, and they're now these days, if you're going to go compete, you got to. Some of those guys are training 5-6 times a week, and
Sure.
it's hard to compete against that. Like you said, that volume is going to matter.
Sure, absolutely.
Volume and time is important.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, you started that question. I kind of lost the thread of it in my answer. You started that question off by asking the sort of like question about the essentially now debunked science of sort of personal learning styles, and it's not that people don't have the personal learning styles; they do. It's does that make them better learners across the board in certain contexts? And what we essentially found was that no, depending on what skill you're trying to learn, certain methods tend to be more effective learning methods than others, regardless of your preference for them or not. So if you're trying to learn how to effectively execute the most clean, beautiful, toe hold ever, and you take Eric's approach and you're like, I'm going to drill the hell out of this technique and getting all the movements right, I'm going to do it again and again and again. If that's the best way that works, it'll be the best way that works whether I like it or not. At the same time, I'm somebody who I know that just carefree rolling for fun is not my optimal way of learning. Like, the best way for me to learn and get better at jiu-jitsu is to do a lot of the more focused drilling, positional rolling, things like that. But I'm just having fun too. So like, I will actively engage in the not optimal technique just because I'm here, I've got an hour and a half, I'm gonna have fun, right? I will still learn something.
I'm gonna give it my leg and see where it goes.
Yeah. I will just have fun with it.
It's like someone had mentioned earlier. Like that's outside of what we were doing. It's not that your comment was wrong or it's just not what we're really talking about right now. But it's like there's a lot of deception in jiu-jitsu. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of play. There's a lot of sometimes I've got to give you something to get what I want.
Sure.
Which is a completely different discussion altogether.
Yeah, and as far as like
more of a tactical discussion.
Yeah, and as far as like if I was trying to get into competition and ADCC and all that kind of stuff, I would not be just doing unconstrained rolling for shits and giggles, because I know that that's not what's going to produce the optimal results. But I'm lucky I'm not in that position, and I, for my own purposes, and so I know I can afford to just learn jiu-jitsu a little slower than I would otherwise, because I can have fun doing it this way too. And so that's really what comes down to with the learning styles thing. Is we know in some cases that learning is optimized if you do X, regardless of whether you like X or not, but there's still merit in doing Y.
And I think that goes, like I said something earlier, I talked about the fun of it, and let's be clear, it's not always fun. I'm sure that if I asked Tom DeBlass how much of your training to prepare for ADCC is fun, he's going to say some. Other stuff is treacherous and horrible and not fun at all. And I mean, that's just doing things at a high level, right?
Sure.
Like, I'm sure Michael Jordan didn't have fun shooting 1,000 free throws every day or whatever crazy stuff he did, but
Absolutely.
Like he knew that the fun part was walking away being the greatest of all time.
Yeah.
I said what I said. You know, like
Yeah,
it's fun now.
Yeah,
You know, that the
absolutely.
conversation of excellence is, you know, this guy's the Michael Jordan of jiu-jitsu. This guy's the Michael. No one says that about
Yeah.
anything else. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
like
Yeah.
that's the fun part.
No, no, absolutely. I totally get
The
that.
fun
I
part is
mean,
people are going to remember him in 7 generations.
yeah, GSP said on Rogan once, and it really stuck with me, that every job has something about it that you don't like. And the funny thing for him was his least favorite part of his job was the day he had to fight.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the other 364 days of the year are amazing. I get to hang out with my friends, train, do all this fun stuff. That day sucks. I hate that day. That's awful. It's like that's
Probably is. He's dehydrated.
it's exactly
You know,
right.
he's about to get punched a bunch of times.
Yeah,
like,
right.
By a guy who actually wants to knock him out. Not people who are helping him.
Yeah.
You know, like
You know.
if God forbid he loses, now he's terrible and shit, and
Yeah, absolutely.
you know, like
yeah.
or he doesn't win in the right way.
Yeah, his
right?
GOAT
Like,
status is questioned.
now,
and all
now
that
it's
kind
like,
of,
oh, he's
yeah.
a boring fighter. It's like, well,
Yeah.
go beat him and tell me he's boring.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that's that definitely factors into there's shitty parts to those pursuits. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I feel like there's probably a ton more that we could talk about, but I feel like we've got through a lot. I really appreciate you coming on and talking
thank you for
about
having
this.
me.
You know,
Yeah,
spending
I'm
your free time
privileged,
doing
yeah.
it. This is again, like this is what Phil gets paid to do. You've done a ton of. Let's toot your
still
horn a
don't
little bit.
know.
Like if we were to talk about some of the research you've done
Yeah.
on learning or
Yeah.
whatever, can you mind like talking a little bit about just kind of like toot your horn? Like he's like,
I've never
"Oh,
done that in front of a camera before.
Yeah, I know, right?
Um,
Like throw him on. just throwing it
No. I
at
mean,
you.
I'm a relatively
You're pretty well respected.
academe. Yeah. I have a very solid international reputation in what I do. I've published, I don't know, 30 some odd publications, stuff that, I mean, it's like jiu-jitsu. It's fun stuff to do anyway.
Yeah. So if you don't believe Phil
yeah.
Hamrick, right?
Yep, Philip Hamrick, Google Scholar me, or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can find me. Yeah,
This guy's an idiot.
yeah, and that's fine. The more you know, it's I feel there's a lot of parallels between, you were talking about jiu-jitsu and education, and sort of, you have bachelor's degrees and things like that, and it's like there's corollaries there, and getting your black belt, I imagine, is maybe that's the PhD, maybe that's a getting tenured or something like that. But like there's still levels and levels and levels
Yeah,
beyond
well, and I
that.
think I don't think it's that.
So-
That's a different discussion too.
Yeah,
but I don't
yeah,
think it's that simple. I think
harder
for
than
some
that.
people maybe. I think
That's
if you
fair.
get a black
Yeah.
belt under maybe like a John Donaher,
Mhm.
where like that's probably more like a PhD. Whereas I think
Oh,
in our
you are
association,
too charitable to academics.
maybe.
I mean, so here's the dirty secret what you need to do to get a PhD is strap your ass into a chair and just do the work. You could argue that that's what you have to do for jiu-jitsu too, but that's what I know. Plenty of PhDs who
As
are
someone who commented, it's a process.
I know plenty of PhDs who are not particularly brilliant. They worked hard to do what they did, and that's really what it came down to.
Yeah.
And I imagine that jiu-jitsu, or probably any pursuit, has those sort of levels. I'm quite good. I have a very great international reputation. At the end of the day, though, I think maybe why I'm so passionate about these things, though, is because I don't really care about that stuff.
Yeah.
I care that the greatest thing that happens to me in my day-to-day job.
You see that I have to like pry it out of him. like he doesn't I have never once been in a class where Phil's like, I'm a doctor at this, and so
I hate people like that. Why would I do that?
It's totally not him. Like he like gets embarrassed even talking about
Yeah,
it. Really, like
no.
it's an awesome thing you've done, and
No, I
a
appreciate
great-
it.
But like yeah, you're just
What-
not that guy. None of our people, none of our physicians are like that. None of
Yeah.
like you wouldn't even know.
Yeah.
If you didn't know, you'd assume he works on cars.
Yeah. No,
or
yeah, what,
just plays in a band.
yeah. Well, what gets me excited is when I can say something in a classroom and I see one student go,
Yeah.
the light switches on.
Isn't that great?
That's like the best feeling in the world, and that's what keeps me going through all like doing the research is fun. But if you told me I could never do research again, I'd be like, that's fine. I've got other things I can busy myself with.
Yeah.
If you told me I can't teach anymore, that would break my heart. And that's really where it
Yeah, I
comes
know what
down
you mean.
for-
And
yeah.
especially the older I get,
Yeah.
I'm starting to understand that there's certain components of jiu-jitsu that I will not be able to do forever.
Yeah.
And but I can probably teach it forever
Right.
to some degree.
Mhm.
Yeah. like I watch a great channel on YouTube is Welcome Steve Scott. It's a judo channel. God, I hope I said that right. But it's a great judo channel. But you rarely ever see Steve doing the stuff. I mean,
Right.
I don't know how old he is, but he, like he's probably got bad knees, probably got, and he's always got his students demoing stuff. But it's
Right.
like you can tell that they're all just super happy to be there.
Yeah.
Like it's like it's in the middle of their class, they're doing these videos for YouTube, and normally that would be annoying to people, but like clearly it's not to them, and like they realize that there's a bigger mission abroad, and
Sure,
like,
yeah, absolutely.
that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like I mean, I've had students, you're teaching whatever, a scissor sweep or whatever, and they finally hit it, and they look at it, and they feel it properly.
Yeah.
It's like they didn't just hit it; they hit it properly.
Yeah.
And like it just worked, and
Yeah.
it's like the light bulb, and they're like, oh my god,
Yeah.
like that person just fell
Yeah.
down, and I felt like I did nothing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
you got it.
Yeah.
Good work.
You had those moments too.
Yeah.
Where you learn.
I have one every scissor sweep's my favorite sweep.
Yeah.
I have one every time I hit it because it seems like it shouldn't work.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh god, they've got to see this guy. Boom. Okay.
No, that's fair. That's fair.
That's awesome.
It's the same for me. It's the sit over sweep for me. The first time I learned it, I was at a different gym, and I learned. Of course, you don't hit it the first time ever. But after we, a couple weeks, couple months, or whatever, I'm just rolling another white belt, and bam, the timing did it, and it was one of those. I stopped the flipping match. I was just like, you could do whatever. Like that worked, and I couldn't even get myself to think about like you have to keep doing jiu-jitsu now. But I kind of still feel that way. Like every time I hit that stupid sweep, I'm just like, this is day one shit, and it's still here, and it's still just as exciting as it was then. But yeah, there's a vividness to that first light bulb moment that you have with so many pursuits, and jiu-jitsu is the same there with that. Yeah.
For sure. Well, thank you for being on. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you guys appreciate it and get something out of this. Listen, I never really ask this in my videos. If you do like it, do me a favor and share it. I'm going to stop that phone real quick. Oh, there it goes. Hold on.
Like, share, send it to your family members. Meaty scissor sweep. Yeah, scissor sweeps can be quite meaty.
Meaty scissor sweep. It's not just a scissor. I'm going to call it the meaty scissor sweep
I like
from now
that.
on.
I like
Who
that.
wrote that? Whoever wrote that, I'm calling it meaty from now on. But yeah, like, share. I would love to get Greg on or Tom or any of those guys, and I'll travel to them, like that's fine. This is what I do for a living. So, if I'm sure if I tell my students, hey, I'm going to be out for a week because I'm going to go train with Tom DeBlas or Greg Souders and talk to them about their theories on teaching and stuff and film it, people would be like, oh, that's fucking cool. So they'd be like, see you in a week.
Absolutely.
Anyway, guys, thank you for watching. Appreciate you all. And Phil, you're awesome. Thank you.
Cheers, man. Thank you.
Now I got to figure out how to turn this damn thing off. Let's see here. There's probably an off button. Close. No, that's not it. See, this is what happens when you give a boomer a phone.
Is there an
Here we
X up
go.
there?
There's an X. Stop streaming.
Hey.
God.